It's time to finish the Hoppin' Down the Bunny Trail bench pillow with embellishments and backing and binding. So I'm ready to put the 3D embellishments on, and I think for the most part I am going to do these before I add the backing. There are a few things, of course, that I can't, like the twine, the little clothespins, and this little quilt. But I think I'm going to try to do the buttons before I quilt. I don't think any of the buttons will go over any of the lines or seams that I'm going to quilt in. Oh, and the little bunny. But I've got a few of these buttons that, remember, I went ahead and stitched out, but I also have the buttons to put on. And so as I was thinking about this, if I would have thought a little bit more about this, I would have in software taken some of these little flying trails that go behind the bee or the ladybug, and I would have taken just that and maybe put an extra plain little trail somewhere else on the quilt where I'm going to put my buttons. I just thought about that, and I thought, oh, that would have been a cute idea. So I could have had my buttons have little trails, but I think I might just put the button, maybe somewhere it's not flying, if that makes sense. So the cute little bees, if I, for example, would have put a bee up here, if I would have added this in software, and when I was stitching the mushroom block, let's say, I could have added a little trail, but I didn't think of that. So for the bees and the ladybugs, I am just going to go place them randomly. I haven't decided yet, so I'm going to take a few minutes to do that. And again, for these, I will probably just put them on something so that they're actually not flying. So I have 2 ladybugs and 2 bees, and then the cute little welcome sign. I think I'm going to wait also on this. This gets, there will be buttons on this mushroom, and then this gets put on that. So this and the other little completely 3D elements, I'm going to, of course, wait. I will take the buttons out, sew the buttons on, and then I'll be ready to put my backing on and do some stitch in the ditch quilting, and then I will do my binding and we'll be finished. So let's get started. So I am going to use embroidery floss to sew my buttons. That way I only need to sew them a couple of times and they'll be on. I pulled a few different colors to match. This is totally not necessary. For example, I found one that matched the little center of the flower. I think I'm going to do black across the bee, and I think I'm going to do red across the little ladybug, and then white on the white. All right, let's get started. I have 2 strands of embroidery floss doubled over, and I will just decide where I want my button, and I'll come up through the bottom I'm going to leave, a longer tail so I can sew it, and I'm just going to put it through once. I think with 4 strands, that will be enough. So I'll put that back through the bottom. Give it a tug. That's cute. And then I will flip it. I'm going to tie a square knot. And then I'm going to leave maybe about a ½ inch or an inch, maybe about a ½ inch. I'm not going to cut it super close, even though this will have a backing on it. I don't, want it to come undone. And so I think also I'm going to put a little dot of fray check, and I will do that, of course, all at the same time. So I will go put my buttons on, and then I'll flip my quilt around and tie the little square knots around everything. And then there's that cute little bee. And with the black, it looks, super cute. Okay, so let's get all these buttons on. Background fabric. The pillow, of course, can be picked up and moved, and if I was making this into a pillow, I would definitely use the correct fabric. However, again, since mine is going to be a wall hanging, I am just going to save this for something else. I will use 2 layers of this muslin for the backing, and I am not going to put any additional batting. I will just put 2 layers of muslin and then do the stitch in the ditch. And then for the binding, I will use the green fabric that was meant for the back, and I will cut my strips out of this fabric. So to make the binding, I cut 3 strips of that green fabric, 2 1/4 inches wide, and I am going to sew them so that there will be a diagonal seam and make the binding, when it's folded, less bulky. And so I will take strips. I have cut the selvages off since it's easier to see and line up, but you don't have to. Flip right sides and put those together, and just line, since I have no selvages, I will just line these up right along the edges together like that. If you have selvages still left on a piece, you would just extend that selvage until this piece starts with the fabric. You wouldn't want that to overlap the selvage, and the same up here. If you had a selvage up here, it would just be, beyond the top of this strip and beyond the side of that strip. And I will just sew from this corner of the top piece of fabric and head towards the bottom corner of the lower fabric. You can pin, you can draw a line, whatever makes it easier. It's such a short distance that I find that you can just sew it and still get a good result without having to pin. So I am going to shoot for this corner right here. Now I have my extension table on. If I had this tape that came all the way down here, I want this corner to eventually line up with this red because that's the center. And so I will start to stitch. And so as I come up to that seam guide, again, if I had it down here, I would be following that red line the whole way, but I will keep the point or the corner of this bottom strip on that red line, and that's will ensure that I get a straight stitch. So when I'm done with that one, I will take this top piece of fabric, find the end, flip it right side up, and find my third piece. And I will do the same thing. I will line up these. Since I have the selvages off, I can just line up, you know, even with the top and the edge. I will slide this corner right to the needle. And then as I'm stitching, I'll keep an eye right here where that corner is and line it up to this red. So now, to double check to make sure you sewed in the right direction, when you take these and pull them apart, it should be like one continuous strip so that eventually, you know, these will get folded over. So if they don't fold out into a continuous strip, you've sewed the wrong direction. So now that I know that that's correct, you can use a rotary cutter. I'm just going to use my scissors, and I will cut both of these 1/4 of an inch or so, and I will press these open. So I have my quilt top ready to stitch in the ditch, and I think I might have mentioned that I was cutting the muslin to the size of the top of my quilt, and I misspoke, so I wanted to clarify that I cut the backing just a little bit larger, and then after I'm done doing all of the quilting, I will cut that to size before I put my binding on. I do have things pinned. I will start from the center blocks, and I'm going to stitch in the ditch, starting with the mushroom and working my way this way. Then I will flip it around and start to the right, and I will do all of these center blocks first. Then I will come in and do the inside of the inner border, and then the outside, and then finally I will start in the center and come from the center of the quilt down between each of the border blocks, and then work my way across, and then do the same thing on the top. So let's start the stitch in the ditch. For sewing, I am going to be using the mono poly thread, and I do have a thread net on the spool, and I will be putting this on a thread stand next to my machine. I will also be using the mono poly bobbin. For the foot, I am going to be using a foot that has a guide down the center, and I will just run this guide right down the center of my seams. as well as a regular foot. And I am just going to sew around the outside of the quilt to hold down the blocks that have not had any stitch in the ditch, and this block, just so that everything lays nice and is attached when I get ready to do my binding. About which way I wanted to put the binding on, I pulled out two of my previous projects. One is the Pumpkins and Potions, and then the last one that I did was the Candy Cane Lane bench pillow, and I did these different. The binding on the Pumpkins and Potions, I sewed to the front and then wrapped it around to the back, and then I stitched in the ditch to secure that binding down. The reason I did that is because of how close the cute border quilting is, and you can see the difference in the width of the binding. And when I had originally done this, I did it like this. I attached it to the back, wrapped it around the front, and it just covered too much of this cute border. So I took that out and redid it. I love the thin binding. I really do. For the Candy Cane Lane bench, I just did it the opposite. I sewed it to the back first, then flipped it around and top stitched. And I was thinking about doing this. It is a little bit easier because it's easier to top stitch, than going stitching in the ditch. But as I was looking at the quilt, I noticed how close this fringe flower is to the edge. And even though I cut it according to the directions, I think if I were to try this binding, I am going to cover up the flower. And so if I were to put these edge to edge and kind of fold this back, you can see that this binding, if I were to sew it to the back and flip it to the front, would cover up that flower. Now I kind of took some binding and flipped it over and tried to, get this little fringe flower out of the way, and it didn't quite work. I could get most of the fringe out. It looked weird, and that was just me testing it, and I'm not even sure if I would have been able to get that to work. Anyways, the other side seems a little bit farther away, and so I think I probably would have still had to move this fringe out of the way, but there probably would have been enough space for that binding to be right next to where this flower's tacked down. But I decided that I'm not going to do that. So I am going to do the binding like I did the Pumpkins and Potions. I will take the binding and I am going to stitch it from the front, and I'm going to use 1/4 of an inch. That way I will just miss this flower, and then I will flip it to the back and then stitch in the ditch. So that's the next step, and that's the way I've chosen to do this. So let's get started on our last step. So I am going to start at the top of my quilt with my binding, since when this is hung up, since mine is a wall quilt, the top will be farther from the bottom, so you really won't be able to see the join at all, but that's what I've chosen to do. So I am going to take the binding and I am going to leave a pretty long piece unsewn, probably a foot or so, and I'm just going to randomly start anywhere. And this long piece that's not sewn on to start will make it easier when I get around to join the binding. And I have a super simple, fast way to join the binding. It doesn't take any measurements like some joining methods, and I'll show you that when we come around, but super, super fast. So I'm going to stitch 1/4 of an inch, and I'll meet you at the corner to show you how I'm going to do the corners. So I've come up to about 1/4 of an inch to the edge of the side of the quilt, and I am going to go ahead and just do a small back stitch and cut off. And then what I want to do is fold this binding to line up with my edge of my quilt. Now you can see mine is not straight. When I was cutting, it's a long story, but I had my ruler end right here and I wasn't paying attention and I veered off. So I'm having to kind of compensate for the fact that this isn't, you know, this is not good, but I'm going to have to make it work. So I will, of course, show you in a corner that is square, but you have the edge of your binding line up with the edge of the next side. And so once you flip it and have that lined up, then you take this and you just fold it back on itself and line it up down the next edge. The fold is lined up to this edge. So here's the fold, and then this is lined up with the next edge. You can clip because, of course, we have to move this, and so if you want to clip or pin so that that stays where it needs to be, I will show that this will be a flap, and that will make our mitered corner when we flip this to the other side. So I am going to secure that, and then I will spin this to the next side. Start it at the top and just continue to sew straight down 1/4 of an inch along the next side. So now I'm coming to the next corner. So here's the bottom. And I want to sew. You don't have to measure it and mark it. You could, as long as you're pretty close to 1/4 of an inch. So here's the bottom. So I've sewn to about 1/4 of an inch. So I'm going to take this piece and fold it up. So my fold is up here and my raw edge is down here. And now you can see what it's supposed to look like, how this edge lines up with the next edge that I'm going to sew. So I will hold it there. This will be on a 45, which again makes our mitered corner. Now I'm going to take this back and flip it. All these hairs out. So that that fold that I flip back lines up with this edge that I just sewed. And this raw edge lines up with the side that I'm getting ready to sew. Pin it or clip it to make it easier to stay. I'm going to pivot. Line up that edge. And continue to sew. So I am coming back around to the top. Here is where I started, and I've left maybe about a foot undone. I am going to go ahead and back stitch and tie off. And get ready to join the binding. Let me show you how super simple this is. Okay, so here is the binding. This is the piece that I started with and went around the quilt. And this piece is the piece that I just ended. So I have this piece that I need to fill in and join so that you can't tell it's joined. So what I'm going to do is lay this starting strip out, and I could have left this a little bit longer to make it easier, but I will lay this out just like it will be sewn, and I will fold this back, and I'm just going to crease it. You could press it, but if you give it a good finger press and make sure you have a crease, then that's fine. Now I'm going to bring this piece that I just ended, and I am going to bring it down, and I am going to fold it back, but I am going to leave a little gap, and that's super important. Other than that, there's really no measuring. I will finger press that. You just don't want these two touching. That will make the binding too loose. So you just fold it back, leave an 1/8 of an inch or so. You don't really need to measure, just a small gap, and finger press. Now I am just going to move these aside, and I am going to kind of just pleat this quilt and get the excess out of the way. I'm going to pin it. You can clip it. So here is our first side of the start that we creased, and here is the second one that we creased where we ended. So the side that we just ended on, open up that. You can see the crease here. And without twisting this, you are just going to open the binding flat. So the crease or the fold from the binding just continues to kind of be on top. You just don't want this piece twisted. It's nice and flat. You just open it up with right side up. And you'll notice that the crease of the binding and the finger press that we added kind of makes a little plus sign. Now take this where we creased, and again without twisting, open that up. So now you have the fold of the binding and this little finger press. Again, without twisting it, you're going to take the fold of the binding and lay it even with the finger press of this, lining up this crease with the fold. We are just going to put these little these little plus signs basically on top of each other. So if I put this fold next to this crease, so I've got it lined up right here, and this crease is lined up with this fold. Now all I need to do is open this, flip it so it will be right sides together, and making sure that this fold up here, or this crease, lines up with the fold of the binding. So you can see how we have that little plus sign lined up right on top. I do suggest pinning this because this we of course will take to our machine, and we need that to stay lined up. Now you can do this right at your machine and not have to pin. You could still pin, but I guess the more you do it, you can do this right at your machine. I probably should have given myself a little bit more slack right here. In fact, I think what I might do is just take out a few of these stitches. Better to have this way longer and have to sew a longer piece and have it easier to stitch. So I am just going to take out some of that. When we stitch, we will start where this ends, of course, and back stitch, and that won't be an issue. So that's going to be a little bit easier to sew. So now once you have this pinned together and you have those little plus signs, those little plus marks lined up, we need to sew from this corner, the corner that's towards the outside of the end of the strip, down, of course, through the center to this other corner that is towards the end of the strip. You wouldn't want to sew from this little inside corner this way. That's not going to be right. So just think that you're sewing closest to the outside of this starting strip. Diagonal, just like we sewed this together, down to the end where these meet, which is to the outside of that strip. So let's go sew that. So I did take my little 1/4 inch foot off and put a regular foot because of course we don't have an edge we're sewing along. And again, here is the edge of the first piece that we started, and I need to start sewing towards the outside. So I will put this under, and this is just like sewing the binding together. You can mark it if you want with the diagonal line. This little plus sign gives you a little point to kind of shoot for at first. We're going to go right through that little plus center and down here. Again, I do have my seam tape up here. I don't have it on my extension table, but I will shoot for when I get here that this little corner I'm sewing to, I can kind of line it up with that red. So make sure everything's flat. And again, let's shoot for that center first. And then this little point that I will end at is right lined up with that red, and I will keep that lined up while I sew. Now, the most important thing is to not cut this off yet. If for some reason you sewed it the wrong way, and if you cut it, then you're going to have to add binding back because it's going to be too short. So always before you cut, open your quilt back up, and this will just kind of fold together, and you can see even with all of this extra binding there that it fits nice, and it's sewn the right way. You can tell because it just folded right up just like regular binding. So now once you know that it's sewn correctly, you will cut this off. You could take it to the mat, but I find that that's not really, it's just easier just to trim it off. Again, about 1/4 inch. You could go press this. However, I find it just as easy to just finger press this one last seam open. Make sure when you fold it back together that stays open. And you can see how nice that fits. It's not too loose, and that's because we left a gap. I'm not sure how that really works out, but that's what it does when you leave that little gap. It fits just perfect. So now this just like looks like any other binding strips that we sewn together. So I will start back up at the beginning. I am going to change my foot just because it's easier and to keep things consistent. And I will continue to sew that 1/4 of an inch, and I will back stitch at the beginning and at the end. So here is the binding sewn on, and it looks really great by the flower on the little tree. So now what I'm going to do is I am going to go ahead and press this binding out and flip it around to the back and then stitch in the ditch, and that stitch in the ditch will catch the binding that has been flipped to the back. I also decided to go ahead and clip, which is something that I normally don't do. I kind of just fold it and go, but I think I'm going to try clipping it this time. And one thing that I did find kind of looking at these corners is at the top where this strip was, remember, folded over when we folded it over and then started sewing it back along this side. I found that if I took a couple of stitches off the top so that the stitching didn't start right at the end, it's like down here, seems to kind of open this up better. Again, we're kind of doing backwards, and seems like it would lay a little bit nicer. And so I'm going to do that as I kind of work each corner to see which way it lays better. I have the monofilament thread back in both the bobbin and the top. I did go ahead and clip all the way around. My corners, I just did the best that I could on each one, kind of folded it both ways to see which would lay better, and held them in place with clips. So now I'm just going to stitch in the ditch all around the quilt. So here is the binding done, and this is the back. So you can see that just caught when I stitched in the ditch. It just caught the backing. It's, you know, it's not perfect. It's a little bit uneven in a few spots because we are sewing blind, but I love it. I love the thin binding. I think it looks great. So let's go take a look at this. So I attached my little ladybug, and I'm getting ready to attach the twine for the little clothesline. On this twine is a little bit thick, so on the mushroom, I did not do a bow. I am just doing like a little slip knot. So this can, you know, be bigger or smaller. And so I will just slip it over the button and then just kind of pull it. I made a bow on this side. I just made it enough so this has a little tiny curve, but I didn't really want to cover up the flowers or the bunny. So I just made a bow, and I'm going to attach it just right here by the boot. So the same way I attach the buttons, I just doubled my embroidery floss and I brought it up through. I am going to bring the needle up through the bottom, kind of through that middle part of the bow, like you would a button. And then just take it down the other side. And then it's just like the button. I will just tie a square knot on the back. That looks super cute. And then this little welcome sign hangs from this button. So I'm going to cut this twine, and I think this is too thick to go through. So I'm just going to unwrap and take one of the strands, there's 3, and use that. And then I think I'm going to tie a little knot up at the top, and then I'll cut that off in a minute. So just one. And even when it's separated, kind of hard to get through that little hole. Put the other one through, and I'm not going to knot it yet until I decide. And I'll just knot it once. I think that's cute. Tie this. I will give this a little bit of fray check, just a dot. And then I'll probably come back and cut that a little closer after that dries. And this little piece has a tape on it, so I'm just going to cut that tape off, and I'm going to kind of untwist it a little bit so it looks like a little bit frayed. Super cute. So I've decided to go ahead and add the ties right now to hang up the quilt. So I'm going to see how that works. And I am following the directions from the Pumpkins and Potions ties with one minor change. So this is a strip of the binding fabric. It's cut to 8 inches by 2.5 inches. And I ironed both sides down. I didn't measure. It's maybe 3/8 of an inch. And then it needs to be folded in half and just press a crease. And then each of the ends will go towards the center and press. And then it's just all folded together with those to the center and then flipped over to the original center crease. And this will just make a little tie onto the top of the quilt so it can be tied to something to hang to the wall. And so now I just need to go and top stitch around the entire strip. So here are the ties. I place them 4 inches from the edge of the quilt and put them about 1/2 of an inch from where I was going to stitch in the ditch. And I just place them next to each other. And so these can just tie onto some type of a hook, or however I decide to hang it up. And I did, of course, both sides the same. So this is what the back looks like. And then the front, and again, I just stitched in the ditch. If this works out for hanging, again, it's kind of long, and so I'm hoping it doesn't droop in the middle. I'm going to have to go test it out and see if it needs some type of a wood dowel or something on the back to keep it straight. But if this is the way I decide to do all of my bench pillows that I make into wall hangings, what I will do is the same thing as the pumpkins and potions, and actually sew these in when I'm sewing the binding, and it will be sewn into this all in one shot. All right, let's go see how this works.